Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the single most consequential geopolitical event for the Canadian economy in 2026 did not happen at a trade summit in Geneva, a tariff negotiation in Washington, or a pipeline announcement in Alberta, but rather in the pre-dawn darkness over Caracas on January 3rd, when United States Special Forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and seized effective control over the largest proven oil reserves on planet Earth? And ask yourself this: in a world where the refineries that buy Canadian heavy crude are the exact same refineries that were originally built to process Venezuelan heavy crude, what happens to the value of your oil when your biggest customer suddenly gains access to a cheaper, closer, and politically captive alternative supply? For decades, the relationship between Canadian oil and American refineries has been portrayed as a marriage of convenience, a mutually beneficial arrangement where landlocked Alberta sends its heavy, sour crude south through a web of pipelines and American refineries specifically designed to process that thick, sulfur-rich oil, turn it into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States, exporting approximately 4.1 million barrels per day in 2024, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. That volume accounts for roughly 60% of all foreign oil entering the American market. To put that in perspective, the next largest foreign supplier, Mexico, accounts for just 7%. We are not simply a trading partner. We are the backbone of the American refining system. But this comfortable arrangement has always rested on a fragile assumption: the assumption that the United States had no viable alternative source of heavy crude at scale. For the last 2 decades, that assumption held true. Venezuela, once America's primary heavy crude supplier, collapsed under the weight of socialist mismanagement, nationalization, and eventually crippling U.S. sanctions. Venezuelan production plummeted from 3.5 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to barely 900,000 barrels per day by 2025. As Venezuela's oil industry crumbled, Canadian oil sands filled the vacuum. Our pipelines were built southward. Our pricing was set at a discount to incentivize American buyers, and our entire economic model became structurally dependent on a single customer who consumed over 95% of everything we produced. That customer is now holding the keys to our competitors' oil fields. And the implications of this shift deserve our most rigorous attention. To understand the gravity of what happened on January 3rd, we must first understand the geology. Venezuelan crude and Canadian oil sands crude are, from a refining perspective, remarkably similar products. Both are classified as heavy sour crude, meaning they are dense, viscous, and contain high concentrations of sulfur. The oil that sits in Venezuela's Orinoco Belt, a 55,000 square kilometer deposit stretching across the country's northeast, is chemically comparable to the bitumen extracted from Alberta's Athabasca region. This is not a coincidence. Both deposits are the remnants of ancient organic material that was never buried deep enough or heated sufficiently to become the lighter crude found in places like Texas or Saudi Arabia. They are geological cousins, separated by 6,000 kilometers, but united by chemistry. This chemistry matters enormously because of how American refineries work, and most people do not appreciate just how rigid refinery engineering actually is. You cannot simply switch a refinery from processing heavy crude to light crude or vice versa without spending billions of dollars on retrofitting. These are not flexible systems. They are purpose-built industrial machines. A coking unit designed to crack heavy molecules cannot efficiently process light shale oil from the Permian Basin, and a hydrocracker optimized for light, sweet crude cannot handle the thick, sulfur-laden barrels flowing from the Orinoco Belt or the Athabasca region. The complex refineries along the U.S. Gulf Coast facilities, like the Motiva Refinery in Port Arthur, Texas, the largest in North America, or the BP Whiting Refinery in Indiana, which was specifically modernized with a $4.2 billion investment to handle Canadian crude, are engineering marvels designed for one purpose: cracking heavy, sour molecules into valuable products. These refineries are the reason Canada has a market, but they were not originally built for Canadian oil. Many of the Gulf Coast refineries were built decades ago to process Venezuelan heavy crude when Venezuela was America's primary supplier. When Venezuelan supply dried up, Canadian crude was the natural replacement. The pipes flowed north to south, the chemistry matched, and the economics worked. Now, with the United States asserting direct control over Venezuelan oil operations, the original supplier is potentially coming back online. The scale of what Venezuela represents cannot be overstated. It is not a minor oil producer coming back online. It is the sleeping giant of the global energy market waking up under American supervision. At an estimated 303 billion barrels of proven reserves, Venezuela sits on the single largest oil deposit in the world, surpassing even Saudi Arabia's 267 billion barrels. Canada, for reference, holds approximately 168 billion barrels, the vast majority locked in the oil sands. The difference, however, is that Venezuela's reserves have been largely dormant. Under Maduro's government, production collapsed to less than 1% of global output. The infrastructure rusted, the engineers fled, the wells were abandoned. It was a resource frozen in time, waiting for someone with capital and technology to unlock it. That someone has now arrived. Following the January 3rd operation, President Trump declared that the United States would, in his words, run everything in Venezuela. He called on American oil majors to invest billions of dollars to rebuild the country's broken energy infrastructure. Chevron, the only U.S. oil company that maintained operations in Venezuela throughout the sanctions era, is already producing approximately 240,000 barrels per day through joint ventures with PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company. At a White House meeting with energy executives, Chevron's vice chairman stated the company could increase Venezuelan production by 50% within 18 to 24 months through its existing operations alone. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, both of which were expelled during Hugo Chavez's nationalizations in 2007 and hold combined arbitration claims exceeding $12 billion against Venezuela, are now actively discussing re-entry. On January 29th, a new law was passed in Venezuela giving private companies control over the production and sale of oil, effectively rolling back 2 decades of state monopoly. I want to pause here and ask you a direct question because this is the critical juncture of this analysis. Do you believe the United States seized Venezuela primarily for democratic reasons? Or does the alignment between the military operation and the immediate opening of oil assets to American corporations suggest something more strategic? Please share your perspective in the comments below. I'm genuinely interested in how you are reading this situation. Now, let us examine what this means for Canada with cold precision, stripping away the diplomatic niceties and looking at the raw economics. The immediate market reaction told the story before any analyst could write a single paragraph. On the day U.S. energy stocks rallied following the Venezuela operation, with Chevron surging nearly 6% and oilfield services companies like Halliburton gaining 9%, Canadian Natural Resources, a flagship of our energy sector, dropped 5%. The bond markets shifted. Investor sentiment recalibrated overnight. The markets understood instantly what many Canadians have been slow to realize. If Venezuelan heavy crude comes back online at scale, it competes directly, barrel for barrel, with Canadian oil sands production for access to the same American refineries. The geography makes this competition particularly acute for Gulf Coast refineries. Venezuelan oil can reach the Gulf Coast by a short tanker trip across the Caribbean, a journey of days. Canadian crude, by contrast, must travel thousands of kilometers through pipelines from Alberta to reach the same refineries, or be shipped by rail at significantly higher cost. According to S&P Global, the 30 to 50 million barrels of Venezuelan crude that could be destined for the U.S. Gulf Coast in the near term would add what they diplomatically call competitive friction. In less diplomatic terms, it means Canadian producers may be forced to accept even steeper discounts on their already discounted crude to maintain market share. The pricing dynamics here are worth understanding in detail because they reveal the structural vulnerability at the heart of Canada's oil economy. Canadian heavy crude, benchmarked as Western Canadian Select, has historically traded at a significant discount to both West Texas Intermediate and Brent crude. This discount exists for 2 reasons. First, the heavy sour chemistry requires more expensive refining. Second, and more importantly, Canada's landlocked geography and limited pipeline infrastructure mean that our oil has fewer places to go, giving buyers enormous leverage to demand lower prices. In recent years, the WCS discount to WTI has fluctuated between $12 and $21 per barrel. When oil is trading at $57 per barrel, like as it was in early 2026, the discount represents a massive reduction in revenue for every barrel Canada exports. Now add Venezuela into this equation. Energy analysts at Rapid and Energy estimate that Venezuelan production could increase by up to 200,000 barrels per day within the first year of U.S. corporate involvement, and could potentially double to 2 million barrels per day within a decade under optimistic scenarios. If even a fraction of that production reaches the Gulf Coast, it gives American refiners an additional bargaining chip. They can play Canadian crude against Venezuelan crude, driving down the price they pay for both. This is the buyer's market that every Canadian energy executive has quietly feared for years. As the Al Jazeera analysis noted, roughly 70% of U.S. crude imports are heavy oil, and approximately 60% of that comes from Canada. Venezuela's re-entry into this market, even gradually, could structurally weaken Canada's pricing power in its most important export relationship. However, the threat is not just about pricing. It is about strategic relevance. For decades, Canadian oil has been described as essential to American energy security. We are the reliable neighbor. We are the stable democracy with predictable institutions. This narrative has been our shield against the worst impulses of American trade policy. But if Venezuela, now effectively under American corporate control, can provide a comparable product from a closer location without the complications of cross-border tariffs, that shield begins to thin. The United States would still buy Canadian oil, certainly, but the dynamic shifts from dependency to optionality. And in geopolitics, optionality for your customer is vulnerability for you. Consider the current tariff environment. Canadian energy exports are subject to a 10% tariff under the Trump administration's trade actions. This tariff, while lower than the 25% applied to other Canadian goods, adds approximately $6 per barrel to the cost of Canadian crude entering the U.S. market. Midwest refineries, which lack pipeline access to alternative heavy crude sources and are essentially locked into Canadian supply, have absorbed much of this cost. But Gulf Coast refineries, which do have access to waterborne alternatives, now have Venezuelan crude as a potential escape route from the tariff. If the choice is between paying a 10% tariff on Canadian oil or importing tariff-free Venezuelan crude of similar quality from a shorter distance, the economics become painfully clear. This is not merely theoretical. The data is already showing movement. According to industry analysis from late 2025, Venezuelan crude imports to the U.S. market resumed meaningful volumes following Chevron's expanded license, with approximately 150,000 barrels per day flowing to the Gulf Coast. Meanwhile, two major U.S. West Coast refineries, Phillips 66 in Los Angeles and Valero in Benicia, California, announced closures in 2025 and 2026, respectively, eliminating demand for approximately 30,000 barrels per day of Canadian heavy crude. The market for Canadian oil in the United States is, for the first time in 2 decades, contracting at the margins rather than expanding. If you're finding this analysis of the energy market shift valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to bring you deep dives into the economic forces that affect Canadian sovereignty and prosperity. Yet, and this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting rather than merely alarming, Canada is not standing still. The response to Venezuela, combined with a broader tariff crisis, has catalyzed what may be the most significant infrastructure pivot in Canadian energy history. The Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, which became operational in May 2024, after a tortuous decade of regulatory battles and a final price tag of $34 billion in public funds, has fundamentally altered the export map for Canadian crude. The expanded system tripled pipeline capacity from 300,000 to 890,000 barrels per day, creating for the first time a significant outlet for Alberta oil to reach Pacific markets. The numbers from the first year of expanded Trans Mountain operations are remarkable. According to Statistics Canada, crude oil volumes exported through British Columbia surged more than 6-fold after the expansion opened. Of the oil flowing through the Trans Mountain system, approximately 48% of exports by volume went to non-U.S. destinations. China has emerged as the dominant new customer, purchasing nearly 40 million barrels of Canadian oil in 2024, a figure that more than doubled to over 100 million barrels in the first 11 months of 2025. In total, Alberta's oil exports to Asia went from effectively zero before TMX to over $800 million within the pipeline's first full year of operation. This diversification is not just a consolation prize. It carries a structural pricing advantage that changes the economics of Canadian oil. When Canadian crude is sold to Asian markets, it is priced against the Brent benchmark rather than West Texas Intermediate. Brent has historically traded at a premium to WTI, meaning Canadian producers receive higher prices for oil shipped through TMX to Asia than for oil piped south to the U.S. Midwest. Chinese refineries, which have invested heavily in advanced coking units designed for heavy crude processing, are actively seeking Canadian supply as a competitively priced, non-sanctioned alternative to Russian and Iranian crude. The mutually beneficial nature of this trade, Canada gets better prices, China gets stable supply, creates a commercial relationship with genuine staying power. But the Trans Mountain expansion, significant as it is, operates at roughly 82% of its capacity according to available data, well below the 96% utilization forecast, and at 890,000 barrels per day, it handles only a fraction of Canada's total production of nearly 5 million barrels per day. This is why the announcement this week of a proposed new West Coast oil pipeline represents such a dramatic escalation. The federal government and Alberta have signed a memorandum of understanding for an Indigenous co-owned pipeline to the Pacific coast, capable of carrying approximately 1 million barrels per day. Alberta is evaluating 5 potential port locations, with Prince Rupert in northwest British Columbia emerging as the leading candidate. The project is expected to be submitted to Canada's Major Projects Office by July 2026 as a project of national interest, which would fast-track regulatory approval. If built, this new pipeline would represent the most significant piece of Canadian energy infrastructure since the Trans Mountain expansion itself. Combined with TMX, it would give Canada nearly 2 million barrels per day of Pacific export capacity, enough to redirect a substantial share of production away from the U.S. market entirely. Prime Minister Carney has described the project as essential to making Canada an energy superpower, and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has called it a sovereignty pipeline. For the first time in modern Canadian history, the federal government and the oil-producing provinces are aligned on the strategic necessity of reducing dependence on the American customer. This alignment is itself a product of the Venezuela shock. For years, proposals for westward pipelines were mired in environmental opposition, regulatory delays, and federal-provincial conflict. The Northern Gateway Pipeline was killed by the Trudeau government in 2016. The Energy East pipeline, which would have moved 1.1 million barrels per day from Western Canada to Atlantic export terminals, collapsed under economic, political, and regulatory obstacles. These were not minor projects. They represented decades of planning and billions of dollars in potential investment, all lost to the political paralysis that defined Canada's energy policy for a generation. But the combination of American tariffs, the fingerprinting requirements for Canadians entering the US, and now the specter of Venezuelan oil displacing Canadian crude has created a political consensus that previously seemed impossible to achieve. The question is no longer whether Canada should diversify its oil exports. The question is whether we can build the infrastructure fast enough. This brings us to the deeper strategic question, and it is one that extends well beyond the energy sector. The Venezuela operation is not an isolated event. It is part of a broader pattern in which the United States is actively reshaping the hemispheric energy landscape to serve its own interests. When Trump declared at his press conference that American companies built Venezuela's oil industry and that the socialist regime stole it, he was not just making a historical claim. He was articulating a doctrine, the idea that American capital creates a permanent claim on foreign resources. The Council on Foreign Relations has described the Venezuela operation as a budding petro-empire with clear 19th century parallels. Whether one views this as justified or not, the implication for Canada is unmistakable. If the United States is willing to use military force to secure access to 303 billion barrels of heavy crude in Venezuela, what does that say about how Washington views the 168 billion barrels sitting in Alberta? To be clear, no serious analyst is suggesting a military threat to Canada. That is not how this dynamic operates between democracies. The mechanism is economic, not military. It is the slow, steady erosion of Canadian pricing power and market relevance. It is the use of tariffs to extract concessions, while simultaneously developing alternative supply sources. It is the expansion of the Defense Production Act to classify Canadian mining operations as part of the U.S. military-industrial supply chain, effectively reserving the output for American needs at American prices. It is what economists call a monopsony trap, a market structure where a single dominant buyer controls the terms of trade with multiple sellers. Canada's response must be multidimensional, and it must be sustained over decades, not election cycles. The first dimension is the physical infrastructure, the pipelines to the Pacific, the port capacity in British Columbia, the potential for northern shipping through the Arctic. The second dimension is market diversification, building durable commercial relationships with Asian, European, and Indo-Pacific buyers who value Canadian supply for its stability, its democratic governance, and its environmental standards. The third dimension is domestic refining capacity. Canada currently has only 1.93 million barrels per day of refining capacity across 17 refineries, while producing nearly 5 million barrels per day. This gap means we export raw crude at a discount and buy back refined products at a premium. Every barrel refined domestically captures value that currently flows to American refiners. The irony of the Venezuela situation is that it may ultimately prove to be the catalyst Canada needed. For decades, our energy strategy was defined by geographic convenience. The pipes ran south because the customer was right there. The discount was accepted because the volume was guaranteed. The dependency was tolerated because the relationship felt permanent. Venezuela's return to the market shatters that complacency. It forces a national conversation about what Canadian energy sovereignty actually means in practice, not as a slogan, but as an infrastructure plan, a trade strategy, and a long-term investment thesis. The early 2030s will be decisive. If Canada can bring the new West Coast pipeline online, maximize trans-mountain capacity, deepen relationships with Asian refiners, and invest in domestic processing, we emerge from this period as a genuine energy superpower with multiple customers, competitive pricing, and strategic autonomy. If we hesitate, if we allow regulatory delays and interprovincial disputes to slow the pivot, we risk being squeezed between Venezuelan crude from the south and American tariffs from the east, selling our most valuable resource at whatever price our only customer deigns to pay. The numbers tell the ultimate story. Venezuela holds 303 billion barrels. Canada holds 168 billion barrels. The United States now has effective influence over both deposits. The question for our generation, for those of us who have spent decades building this country's prosperity on the foundation of energy exports, is whether we will allow the second largest reserve in the Western Hemisphere to be managed as a captive supply for American refineries, or whether we will summon the political will and the engineering ambition to build the infrastructure that allows us to sell our oil to the world on our own terms. The pipes can flow west as easily as they flow south. The tankers can sail to Shanghai as efficiently as they deliver to Houston. The geology is ours. The reserves are ours. The only question is whether the strategy will be ours as well. That is not a question of geology. It is a question of national will. And if there is one thing the history of this country teaches us, it is that Canadians, when pushed far enough, find a way. Thank you.